This presentation will look at macromolecules. Now, I think most of us know what molecules are. Macro is another word for big. Macro invertebrate would be a large invertebrate, something I can see with the naked eye, where a microinvertebrate would be something very small. Microscope looks at things that are very, very tiny. A macro lens on a camera takes small things and makes them look big. So macro means big molecules. Of course, all of these molecules are going to have carbon as a central atom. Carbon has 4 electrons in its outermost energy level. So if we had the C, we have a dot, 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 4 unpaired electrons, which means that carbon is able to make 4 covalent bonds. Carbon, there's the 4 covalent bonds that carbon can make. It can make those 4 covalent bonds with 4 other atoms. That's important. No other substance can do 4 bonds as well as carbon can. Silicon, being right below it on the periodic table but in the same group, can do 4 bonds. However, they are not as good as carbon. Only carbon makes long chains of organic molecules. And oftentimes in life, we see carbon bound possibly to other carbon, absolutely with hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. All of these are important for the molecules that make up living things. Now, the simplest of all of the hydrocarbons, of all of the organic molecules, would be carbon with 4 hydrogens around it. That's our methane molecule. Something I forgot to correct there, but compounds that contain carbon and hydrogen are called organic. In most cases, if carbon's touching a hydrogen in some part of the molecule, it's an organic compound. There are some inorganic carbon-containing compounds, such as carbon dioxide. We don't really call CO2 organic because there aren't any hydrogens involved. Now, when we think that organic means healthy, like organic food, it's not necessarily always the case. This here is hydrogen cyanide, very toxic poison. It has a carbon, it has a hydrogen. We call this an organic compound with the nitrogen. However, extremely toxic to living things. It smells like almonds. We know because they've used it in the gas chamber. When people smell it, they say it smells like almonds and then they die. So cyanide is a very deadly organic compound. So let's not assume that everything that's organic is healthy. Now, I did not actually add these animations, I will say. I think they're a little bit confusing, but I'll have to edit them out later. So macromolecules, that's what we talked about. Macro, big molecules, are large, generally organic molecules. Now, these are so large, they're so long, because carbon is the central atom, and carbon is excellent at making very stable single, double, and triple bonds. That's what carbon specializes in, and that is why we as humans, and actually all life on this planet, is based on carbon. Now, anytime you see carbon-hydrogen bonds, as we've talked about before, carbon-hydrogen bonds are nonpolar. This means that they are hydrophobic. This particular substance is butane. Butane does not dissolve in water. It likes to avoid water. Now, at room temperature, butane is a gas. But if we get to 5 carbons, make it pentane. 6 carbons, make it hexane. 7 carbons, heptane. 8 carbons, octane. The octane is a liquid. Octane will not dissolve in water. It's hydrophobic. Because these carbon-hydrogen bonds are nonpolar, which means that water, looking for those charged regions, can't find it on a nonpolar molecule, and therefore hydrocarbons that are liquids will not mix with water. They're hydrophobic. However, bonds with oxygen and hydrogen, we have hydrogen bonding. This is methanol. It's like methane, except there's an O and an H on it. That's an alcohol group. Methanol will dissolve in water. Why? Because this side of the molecule looks very much like a water molecule. It has these partially negative areas here, partially positive here. This may be nonpolar, but since this part of the molecule is polar, it will mix with water freely. This is something called formic acid or methanoic acid. Same idea. We have this oxygen with the highly electronegative pull on electrons, partially negative charges here. On this hydrogen, we have partially positive. This oxygen also is pulling the electrons away from carbon, so this would be a partly positive and this a partly negative charge. We see this with the oxygen compounds that are tied to carbon. We see this with the nitrogen compounds that are tied to carbon. So nitrogen, also very electronegative. Nitrogen has a strong pull on the electrons, and this will have a partially negative charge, while this has partially positive charge. These sorts of compounds, because they have a polar portion, just like water does, they are hydrophilic, which means they love water, they mix with water. Hydro, water. Philic, loves. They love water. Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. It all comes from the same root. Whereas hydrophobic are scared of water, do not mix. But these three compounds, this is methanamine or methylamine, this is methanol, and this is methanoic acid or formic acid. All of them mix very readily with water because they have those polar partial charges on them, just like water does. This would be hydrogen bonding, this would be hydrogen bonding, this would be hydrogen bonding. Okay, so macromolecules can be put into long chains. We call them polymers. Plastic is an example of a polymer. It's the same small molecule attached over and over and over and over again in a chain. We call those little building blocks monomers, which hopefully will make more sense very soon. Examples of polymers would be carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are generally made of sugars. That's the monomer. Is some sort of a sugar is the monomer, and carbohydrates are the polymer. Lipids, we'll see a little bit more closely. They are long chains of carbons and hydrogens. Most lipids are hydrophobic because of those carbons and hydrogens in the chain. They're hydrophobic because they have a nonpolar portion on them. Proteins, which are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sometimes sulfur. Proteins are made of amino acids. And then we have the nucleic acids, the DNA, the RNA. These are the coding regions of our bodies, and they are made primarily of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Now we'll look at each of these monomers a little bit, but I just want you to see carbohydrates are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Lipids also carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. These generally do not contain other elements in them, with one exception, which we'll see when we get to the cell structure. Proteins, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur. Nucleic acids, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus. So be aware that different polymers have different groups of elements that they are made of, which we should see when we look at some of these subunits. So these are the monomers that form life. We have the sugar. Now, sugars are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. They are carbohydrates. Hydrate comes from water, a hydrogen and oxygen. Carbon is obviously carbon. So carbohydrate has carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, just like that. Now, what do I make about these parts of the molecule? This is because some people get very tired writing all of the carbons all the time. So actually, here we have 1 carbon, 2 carbons, 3 carbons, 4 carbons, 5 carbons, 6 carbons. So that's C6 if I were to write a molecule. Hydrogens, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now there is also assumed for an organic chemist to be 8, 9, 10, 11. There's got to be one more around here. Oh, and 12 off of right here. So it's C6, H12, and then O, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is glucose. This is a very, very important sugar. It's made of a ring. The ring has 5 carbons and 1 oxygen, and then there's another carbon hanging off. Each carbon in this ring also has a hydrogen coming off of it. It's just most organic chemists don't want to make the picture too confusing, so they just assume this is a C with another hydrogen coming off, a C with another hydrogen coming off. This is glucose C6H12O6. But what you need to know right now is that carbon, hydrogen, oxygen are the carbohydrate, which is a sugar. When you put these sugars together, you make complex carbohydrates, which we'll see in another video. Fatty acids, the lipids, just like I said, the subunit of a carbohydrate. The subunit of a carbohydrate is a sugar. One of the subunits of a lipid can be a fatty acid. This has an acid component. Now, you don't have to worry about this too much, but this is what we call a carboxylic acid. But look at the rest of the molecule. Carbons and hydrogens. That means it is very nonpolar. This region here might be polar, and it is fairly polar. However, this area, not polar. Most fatty acids really do not mix with water for that reason. And again, what are sugars made of? What are carbohydrates made of? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. What are fatty acids made of? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. There's nothing else in this molecule besides those three types of atoms. Moving on to the next one. This is one of the simplest of all amino acids. And you notice, like I showed you with the fatty acid, we have a carboxylic acid and we have an amine. That's your amino acid. And this is the simplest of the amino acids, which is called glycine, which has one hydrogen, two hydrogens coming off of a central carbon. You get to see here carbon, 4 very stable covalent bonds. These particular bonds right here, nonpolar, nonpolar, nonpolar. This one is polar because it's connected to a nitrogen. These bonds here are polar because they're connected to oxygens. And remember, these oxygens pull hard on electrons, giving them a minus charge. This hydrogen doesn't have its electrons as much and has a positive charge. Same thing here. This nitrogen pulls hard on the electrons, has a partially negative charge. These hydrogens have a partially positive charge. This means that amino acids generally are hydrophilic. They like to mix with water. They mix very well because they have polar regions on their molecule, just like a water molecule does. So amino acids are primarily made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and two of these amino acids, instead of having a hydrogen sticking off here, will have some sort of a sulfur-containing group. We'll have some sort of a sulfur-containing group. That means that sulfur is also an important component of proteins, which is the polymer of the amino acid, which is the monomer. Think of the word mono. Mono means one. So a monorail moves on one rail. A monomer is one unit of a large polymer. Poly means many. So a polymer would be protein or possibly starch in a carbohydrate or some of the fats that we have. Now, some of the longest polymers are these, made of nucleotides. These are the nucleic acids. This is your DNA, your RNA. Now, if you remember what I said about the carbohydrates, here we have carbon, hydrogen coming off, carbon, hydrogen coming off, carbon, hydrogen coming off. This is a 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's a 5th carbon right here, 5-carbon sugar called a ribose. Different kind of sugar than the glucose, but that's one portion of this larger monomer called a nucleotide. So nucleotides contain nitrogens. Those nitrogens mean that we have polar, partially minus charges on these portions of the molecule. What this does is allows it to stick to another nucleotide, which we'll see very soon when we talk about DNA. DNA is a double-stranded molecule. One of these is connected by these hydrogen bonds, these polar regions of the molecule, connected to another DNA strand. These are some of the longest of all of the polymers that we have in living organisms. And these carbon and oxygen and hydrogen and nitrogen containing compounds also have a phosphorus. This is what we call a phosphate group, which we'll see quite a bit more as we go on. But right now you need to know, for the monomers, sugars make up carbohydrates. They have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Fatty acids are one component of lipids. They also have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. However, lipids generally have long chains of carbons and hydrogens. They are very nonpolar. Sugar has lots of oxygens, which means it's polar. Sugar dissolves in water. because of that. Because of this long nonpolar chain, fatty acids do not dissolve so well in water. With the amino acids, carbon is covalently bonded to 4 other molecules. 2 of those atoms, or 2 of those sides of the amino acid, are very polar, which means that this will dissolve in water fairly well. And then with the nucleotide, same thing. Lots of polar regions on this molecule, which when you form a long chain, even if you form a long chain, it will still dissolve in water. Our DNA does dissolve in water. So that's really the basic introduction into macromolecules, which are big molecules, which are monomers that get to put together into polymers, which are the most important molecules for living things.